Everybody hear me okay? Good. We're here to talk about privacy and data. We're here to talk about where the individual's right keeps going and where our use of the data begins. We're here to talk about, do we control the data as individuals, or does the data control us, and where are the ethical boundaries in all of that? So that's what we're going to explore here, and I get the easy job. I just get to ask questions. Our panelists today have the more difficult job to tell us some answers on these things. So the first thing I'd like to do is just have our panelists introduce themselves and tell us just who you are and what you do. Start with Gina.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm Gina Miller. I'm Director of Customer Experience and Demand Management at a marketing agency in Chicago called CBD Marketing. And what I do is shape strategies through both research and communications planning and program execution.
I'm Daniel Lathrop. I'm the projects data editor at the Dallas Morning News. I use data to find and tell stories, both of the conventional blobs of text kind and of kinds that are told with more interactive, pointy, clicky experiences.
I'm Denise Polverine. I'm the Director of Digital Operations at Northeast Ohio Media Group. Have been here many times in my former role as Editor-in-Chief of Cleveland.com. And we use data in many ways. We collect information about our users, much as other sites do, and we also use data for our reporting and to tell really interesting stories. So data, this topic is really rich, and I can't wait to dive in.
I should have added that in the marketing world, we use data every single day for every single application, pre-post marketing initiative. We're measuring everything that we do, and we're also studying everything around us. So that includes our consumers, it includes the values and the trends and what's going on in science and what's going on in academia, as well as a wide variety of other industries. We actually never leave school. We just keep going to school. So it very much is a discipline that's driven on data.
So to get started here, just briefly, if you could tell us, what have you done recently that was an exceptional public service where you've used data? And before we get into privacy, what's the good part?
Well, let's see. I think we just we did a I'm very proud of it, piece in the Morning News on workplace deaths, workplace fatalities. Oddly enough, it came out right about the same time that the McClatchy chain did a really amazing series on some related issues, but we looked at what was driving workplace fatalities across the country, and we looked at what the projected rates of workplace fatalities. We found that Texas was unusually high, but we also found that Texas was not unusually high for the reasons that you would think. There's lots of people doing very dangerous things in Texas. The people doing dangerous things in Texas were safer than the people doing dangerous things in other places. The people who were less safe in Texas were people doing moderately dangerous things like construction work. And we also found that it probably was not related to lack of regulation, which people always think whenever something comes up in Texas, that it's because we don't regulate business. And it is true that we go out of our way not to regulate things, but in this case, I think we were able to show that wasn't the driving factor.
We at Northeast Ohio Media Group use data, like I said, all the time. We have one dedicated reporter who does nothing but collect data, parse it out, make sense of it, present it, and works with our journalists. However, a lot of our other reporters, our crime and our community reporters, are also starting to gather that type of data and offer it up with their stories. So we do a lot of things. We have, I'll just really briefly show a couple of things. We have a weather database where you could go back to 1900 and look at any date in weather, and that's pretty interesting. We've used that for stories. It's something that's fun if you just want to see on your birthday what the weather was like, or St. Patrick's Day or something like that. But it also allows people to say or make sense of the weather. Like this past winter when it was incredibly cold, everyone was saying this is the coldest winter we've ever had. Well, actually it really wasn't. We could go in and pull out bits of information and show, another year it was equally as cold or even colder. So that type of information. We also have report cards that I think the last panel talked about, and that's really interesting. And while all of us probably offer, in the media, offer Ohio report cards or, report cards in your state, it is really critical in your community. This really is a telling story how your community is performing and what your taxes are being used for. So the school report cards, that's incredibly popular, as well as property transfers, things like that. So we do a lot of different ones. I would say that those are two of the most popular ones. We also have a Browns historical database where you could search for any Browns game that has been played. You get all the results, all the game stories that we've written. So that's popular as well. I could, pull out other examples, maybe I will later, but things like that are very popular.
Well, in my job, I get to do a lot of good, maybe not public good, but definitely our focus is helping our clients better relate and serve their customers and their audiences. So I'm responsible for driving research into some of the needs and unmet needs of populations related to a specific product line. So one example might be an alternative energy provider, retail energy provider who wants to enter into the market of an established utility, and helping them. This industry is not, maybe the strongest marketers or communicators. So helping them understand what are the fears of, what are the attitudes, how can they best engage that market and help educate and provide solutions to customers. That's really one example, and I think it's indicative of really the underpinnings of our industries really trying to connect the buyer and the seller in a more intimate way.
Okay, let me ask this question. What's one of the most challenging data collection projects that you've done? And if you had it to do over again, what would you do differently with that project?
Well, I would say that, all of them are somewhat challenging. You're trying to get a lot of information and make sense of it. The census comes to mind as one that wasn't particularly difficult, but the way that you present the information so that it makes sense for the communities that you serve is a little challenging. And it's challenging, but it's also really cool, and it's really something that's very exciting for journalists because you can parse out that information. There's probably 1,700 different ways you can tell stories from the census data. So today we were looking at poverty rates, and so you can, as a journalist, use this type of data and think of new stories to tell based on it. So getting the information isn't necessarily difficult. And I can't think of one that's been particularly difficult, but we have been challenged with trying to use the data in a smart way to tell stories, because I think data is best used when you have a journalistic reason for using this data. You don't want to just put up data because you can, and I mean, there's probably some merit to some of those databases that are just for fun, but usually we use it to tell stories. So that's, when you have so much data, that's where it becomes a little challenging.
I think the most challenging data-related project I've ever done or run, for a long time I had the good fortune to work at the Center for Public Integrity. Chuck Lewis came up earlier by his book, my old boss there. We decided we were going to look at travel-sponsored junkets. Junkets taken by members of Congress and their staff, paid for by private individuals, nonprofits, corporations, trade associations. And for a long, long time, Congress had collected this information and dutifully made it public by putting it in a small room in a sub-basement of the Capitol, in file folders, and generally speaking, the ones available to the public were bad photocopies of the forms that were kept somewhere else. And then if you wanted to go back in time, some of them didn't exist. Other ones were on microfilm. And this was not a long time ago. This was just a couple of years ago. And so working with students from Medill and with American Public Media, people who produce Marketplace, we launched a project to enter data on every single one of these, and we were going to put a database online, which we eventually did. I would have thought twice, maybe 3 times before. I'm glad we did it, but it was an excruciating experience because it turns out that that members of Congress were filling these things out by hand with very poor handwriting and doing things like they didn't know how to fill the forms out. So what they entered into the form was frequently wrong, and we ended up having to have everybody at the Center for Public Integrity working across all of the projects basically had to, at a certain point, dropped everything for a week, and we went through and had 2 people look at every single one of those forms because because we just didn't know what we had after the data had already been entered.
I will just add one more that's been really challenging, has been crime, just because each municipality reports it somewhat differently. Some communities don't really want you to know the crime that takes place in the community, even though, a lot of it is public record or from police reports, or they want certain parts of police reports, shielded from the public. So that has been challenging. I guess crime reports would be the one that's, just because there's inconsistency among municipalities, that's been challenging.
In my world, that's more about any type of quantitative study and making sure that we've got, that the people that we engage are really representative of our communities. And there's many underrepresented communities and marginalized communities, and understanding, how to connect with those populations and have them be represented in the economy, in the business world. And whenever you're doing any sort of quantitative study, it is really thinking about how can I, fully represent all of the diversity and the varying levels of economic power in our communities.
And you're kind of getting into this, but what are the ethical guidelines you use when you use data? What kind of points do you have that you want to hit to make sure that you're using the data correctly and in an ethical way?
I would say, that's a really tough question, but I would say that, we always try to think along the lines, as I said before, of what is journalism. If we get access to a database that we just, want to put up and we don't really have a story to go with it, say, for example, you could have access to all of the salaries in, a school district or something like that. That might be informative. It might be something that people would want to know, but let's think about that and think about why we would want to tell that story. So I think those are the types of things where ethics comes to play. Are you using data to tell a story, or are you just just throwing it up there. Everything, and I think the last panel kind of touched on this, where you're talking about context. There was a question about context, and as journalists, I do think we have to provide context to why we're offering this information, how to use this information, and what's there and what's not.
I think my biggest ethical concern tends to be one, are we telling an accurate story to the best of our ability? It's very easy to tell an incomplete story if you have incomplete data. That's why one of the reasons that reporting is a key part, understanding what's in the data, as Jennifer once taught me to interview my data, like I would be interviewing a source, and I think that's, so number one, that's I think the biggest first ethical commitment of any journalist is to seek the truth and report it. So you have to really make sure you understand and that you're not glossing over some problem, that you're not trying to say something that is beyond what the data can say. The second thing that I try to do is to make sure, to the extent that I am identifying individuals or that I am engaging into places where some people might feel like their privacy is being intruded upon. And by the way, frequently people have a fairly, particularly public officials, have a fairly broad sense of what they think their privacy ought to include, such as, for example, public money that they're getting to go on junkets. But I try to think, you weigh what's the public interest. I'm working on our own crime map right now, and one of the issues is making sure, for example, that we don't stigmatize people who report certain kinds of crimes, people who report domestic assaults, people who report sexual assaults, and figuring out what the balance is between reporting those, because they're very important things, and providing information that might make people less likely to report them. And it's not an either or, there's a balance to be struck.
Yeah, it's similar for me. I coach clients with, really 4 tests of what's an ethical use of the data. And, they're umbrellas, really, because ethics are personal things, and you really have to work as a culture to articulate those and create a business culture that supports adherence to those. And so I start with a few big umbrellas. One of them is if you're doing it for yourself, for a motivation that's purely about revenue or about creating that competitive difference, and you're not connecting the use of that data to a benefit or a value for your customer, then you've crossed a real line, and you need to take a hard look at that. The second umbrella is that if you're opening up somebody up for risk of harm, much like, this is something that you've talked about a lot in this room, if there's any sort of either a risk for your company and your employees or a risk for the customer, then that's a line that you need to really take a hard look at before you cross it. This is sort of a no-brainer for advertising. We have lots of professional standards around this one, but if you are selling data or using it in a way that your customer doesn't know you're using it, that's a line you need to address. And the fourth is if you're collecting a whole bunch of data that you don't really need to drive your business, take a look at that, because it's not only a risk, but it is a potential temptation to delve into areas you really shouldn't. So there's many businesses that don't need a lot of deep dimensional data on their customers in order to drive a very successful business. And that's one of the areas that we're really looking at from an industry standpoint is, yeah, we have all this data, but do we really need to use it? And what are the costs and benefits of that?
And you all touched on this just a little bit here, but let's talk a little bit more about the individual and privacy and the data. When you use the data, how do you strike a balance between the individual and his or her privacy and the story you're trying to tell or the business result you're trying to drive? If we have data that identify characteristics of individuals, what questions should we be asking ourselves before we use that data in a story or in a campaign or anything else?
I guess, when you were talking about census, there are some statistics that are held back, and there's a reason for it. If the Census Bureau, maybe under the number of 5 people or something like that, if they don't report certain aspects of income or something like that, it's something that we're aware of, and we want to make sure that we're not exposing people or putting them at risk. If schools and the report cards, if some of the districts aren't reporting, certain types of students, we have to weigh everything, as you said. We sit there and we have discussions about it and what could be perceived as us picking on someone or, types of people. Those are really heavy conversations to have, because what are the benefits of you putting that data out there? So I would suggest that in any of these conversations, when you look at data, and again, you're going to find so many different stories to tell, that you are thinking about the individual. If you're looking at salaries and there's no benefit to putting that, someone on the janitorial staff is making $8,000 a year, would that be an embarrassment, or would that be something that you're just trying to do and could get criticized for doing it? So I think, just weighing that and having those conversations, and there's no clear-cut answers. It's something that you have to decide with your management.
For me, I mostly work with government data, obviously, that I get through public records requests. And I do have sort of a principle, which is that, mostly if it's information that people didn't want other people to have, the government shouldn't be collecting it anyway. And so my presumption is that if something is an open record that the public has the legal right to have access to, and I have gotten access to it, and there is some useful purpose for the public to have it, then I should put it out there. On the other hand, I also do sometimes get data that there is no useful purpose to putting out there, and so I try not to share that, in part because it's a waste of time, and in part because, if there isn't, in my mind, a legitimate reason for people to be looking at it, that's not what I want to spend my efforts and my time doing. I do think the example that I gave in terms of domestic violence and sexual assault, there is, when you're dealing with criminal justice agencies, they will often try to withhold a lot of that information, including information that is clearly public information, from your requests, and I think that's morally wrong. I think that government is obligated to share information that it collects with its citizens, and if it's information that that the government and we as the people who are the government feel ought not to be collected, then the solution to that is not for the government to collect it and keep it secret. The solution is not to collect it at all. But there is also harm that we can create by the way in which we publish things. And I certainly do not, for example, in the case of domestic violence and rape victims, it is important, it is deeply important for people to know that this is happening in their community. And police agencies and news media that simply suppress that information out of concern for the victims, while it's a legitimate concern, are doing a deep disservice to the citizenry and to democracy, to hide that kind of information. And so if it is information that we want to suppress at some level, it is, I think, deeply important to figure out how you make sure that information is still communicated.
I I think in saying that though, you know, especially with domestic violence and rape, and this was some of the things that I was mentioning when we were talking about the difficulties of putting together crime databases. Because you're dealing with a lot of, you know, different municipalities, as I said, but you also should report how many crimes there are in a community and what types of crime. But then there's the discussion, but how specific do you have to get with that information? Because then could someone be identifiable, and would that cause harm to their life? So those types of things, but I absolutely agree. You want to report in communities that you cover what is happening there, and you should, but then you have to decide how much of that information to reveal.
Exactly right.
Yeah, as it relates to striking a balance between driving a business result and balancing well, we don't necessarily have that issue of individual privacy in the same way that you do. Our exposure happens in the use of personalized data, for instance. If something's on the file that, you know, shouldn't have been, and it gets on a mail piece, that's when, you know, we have the biggest issues. But by and large, one-to-one communications, you know, the risk of an individual in marketing, in terms of the release of any sort of private information, is actually remarkably low, because it's very expensive, you know, and business is, you know, all about you know, driving the best price and the best revenue for a company. So actually we have the better story to tell in the use of data to improve business. And often that is aggregated data, so that we're able to sort of view populations and the behaviors that they tend to follow, or their propensity to do things, rather than drill down necessarily on this individual who we know goes to Starbucks every single Tuesday at 9 a.m. and this is exactly what they buy, you know. So there's, do we have the ability to do that? Yes. It's so incredibly expensive, and there's been a lot of backlash based on just consumers not, you know, they want the relevance, they want the extra service and the perks, but they don't want to be creeped out. So, you know, the consumer tells us when we've stepped over the line, and we listen very closely.
Okay. This is kind of a long question, which is uncharacteristic for me, but I'll give it a whirl here, so stay with me. Gene and I were talking the other day, and we came across a scenario on who owns data and how it was used, and it goes like this. I buy a database, or access a database that's public. Then I merge it with another database. I've created a new database, something that wasn't there before. And now I'm using this information in a way that the individual who gave up the information to begin with may not even know about, or may not have intended that it be used. And the inference can be wrong, or it can be, as I said, unintended. Is that a fair thing to do?
It depends, I think. When we do that in marketing, what we want to overlay on any database are things that help us better understand, not on a micro level, but on a macro level, the world of this person. You know, what sort of content would they like to read? You know, what kind of interests do they have? You know, you know, is it NASCAR, or is it shopping? You know, what can we do to relate to this person, to bring value to this person, to bring valuable offers to this person? You know, it's really motivated by how can we be more relevant. But when it gets down to the level of things like overlaying, you know, what kind of car you drive, and there are things that I know consumers don't want us marketers to be able to overlay. For instance, their credit scores. There's other things that I know that they would hate for us to know, that are potentially available in compiled data. But I have not met any marketers who exploit anything like that, simply because it's incredibly expensive, and when you get right down to it, getting down on that micro level is just not practical. We really are taking a look at populations and tendencies rather than who you are and your exact desire.
Go ahead.
Well, I would say for me, it's pretty much governed by the public interest. If I'm pursuing a legitimate public interest with data that I have, I think using it to do analysis, using it to figure things out can be really important. Sharing it, I don't use it for marketing. I'm unlikely to, let me think of an example of government data. So if two low-level government employees seem to frequently stay at the same hotel at the same time, and it doesn't seem like there's a good reason for that, I would be very unlikely to do anything with that, even though I've found it out from a database of government reimbursements. On the other hand, if the mayor and one of the mayor's top aides were doing the same thing, it would be pretty understandable because they're probably traveling together. But if there was some information that suggested something improper was going on with a senior government official, I might use that in a different way.
Yeah, I think it's what we've been saying. It's just, if you can carefully, same ethics of journalism apply with anything that you do. If you are obtaining information and you're overlaying it with something else, as long as you are accurate and you're not coming up with some product that skews the information, then I think that you're fine. I think there are different ways to parse out information, look at information, but as Daniel was saying, you have to interview your data. You have to make sure that what you're presenting to your audience is accurate. So you can get data from a couple of different sources or use it and interpret it in different ways, but as a journalist, you still have to look at what you have as the end result, and is this accurate and fair in what I'm reporting. So as far as a marketing perspective, I know that overlaying is done all the time. So there's a combination of, information that you get from different places that they do try to create, maybe not specific individual profiles, but what this person might like or what they are likely to purchase and things like that. So it's a little different.
I think where the line should be drawn is what type of inferences we're making about individuals. If we can get down to that level and it starts to look like this set of things looks like this person has this set of religious or political views, or has these biases, or maybe we can use that information beyond its intended use, then that's where the line really is crossed. And as we approach the reality of daily access to big data, what we need to keep in mind is that the farther that you get away from the context of that data collection, the farther, the less accurate it is. So we as human beings don't do things in a straight line, and we're not always the same person. From day to day, we might do something very, very different. So what I coach our clients to do is keep the data in context. Look at your data in context. Whatever overlay you're making, still the main focus will be on the contextual data of where that client was, what kind of customer that is to you, what they're buying, what they need, what they've told you, what their behaviors are, rather than all of these other layered on things. That's what's important to your business. And that should be your focus. I think it's when we start to combine my purchase data with my political data, with my environmental data, that's where we really get into a lot of trouble making any sort of judgments about who that person really is.
And it's commonly done. I mean, by big ad agencies and marketing firms, there is some of that going on where if you're searching in Google for something like, divorce attorney, and then you all of a sudden go apply for something, and maybe there's a case in which they would say, well, people who are going through a divorce are more likely to default on their loans or something. There are cases where we've read about that people have this aggregate information about people and make assumptions based on a couple of the searches they've done on Google, or maybe they've typed in anxiety in Google and, oh, well, we're going to start serving that person ads on medications and things like that. So it does get a little, it's something that is worth exploring.
I'd really like to know who Google thinks I am, because what I do every day, I am visiting so many different websites. They've got to think that I'm just a little on the strange side.
And I think that's where it gets dangerous, and that's what the big discussion is about. Can you really hone in on what a person is like based on their searches or Gmail topics, things like that.
Along those lines, and thinking about privacy and the ethics of data and the accuracy of data, is it fair to turn to Facebook or social media to harvest data? What do y'all think about that?
We do so only in terms of understanding the sentiment, not the individual. These things are only useful to us as it relates to what's the value that's being represented. What is, if it's information related to, a customer posting to Facebook hoping for a business solution to their problem, that's one thing. But mining it in terms of trying to connect who that social person is with my customer data, that's not really all that useful. So we're really focusing on where's the sentiment going, and where's our company need to be out ahead of that and managing our relationships.
For news gathering purposes, sure, we use it all the time. We go, people have a public profile on Facebook or another social network, and we're reporting on that person. We'll go take a look, just like we might interview their neighbors, just like we might read articles that they've written in some publication. It's to my mind, it's the same thing. I don't engage in bulk collection of Facebook data, and that would be probably a very different area for me. But if it comes to things that people are posting publicly, openly on the internet, and I'm reporting on that person, I absolutely, I think I have an obligation, actually, to look at it to help me understand who they are.
That's the same way in which we use it.
That one was easy. So you folks are data professionals, I guess. So what scares you most about the way data is used?
I actually think it's a little overblown as far as, I'm personally not too scared about it, but I think you do have the ability to set your privacy settings on a whole lot of things. I mean, a lot of us don't do that on our browsers. If you wanted to disable cookies, you could do that. If you wanted to change your IP address or spoof where you're, where you really are, right now you can be identified as being in Kent, Ohio, but you could go to the trouble of saying you're in Norway or something like that. So you can take a fair amount of this into your own hands. However, when you say that you're not accepting cookies, then you really do change your browsing experience, because then a lot of sites require cookies and things like that. So there are, Facebook, for example, has a bazillion privacy settings that you can really lock that down on who sees what. So on most things you can lock it down. There are certain things that that you can't. And, you know, everyone says, be careful what you do on the internet because it's all public, and that part of that is true, or most of that is true. But, you know, it's the same type of thing when you go to Giant Eagle and get the rewards card. That isn't just so they can give you all kinds of rewards, you know, just because they like you. That is because they're trying to get information from you that they can sell to people as well, that they can get information on their customers and then, you know, use that information to give to some of their suppliers and things like that. So we do it in our daily lives, online, offline. So that, you know, we just have to be mindful of that.
I guess I've come to the conclusion that personal privacy is dead, and not that it should be, but the government is reading all of our email and storing it in soon to be in Utah, currently in San Antonio. Go Texas, so I find that truly disturbing. I think I find it, and I don't trust what people will do in the future with access to that kind of information. And I think, to me, the far bigger threat than Google or Yahoo marketing to us is future government using it to identify people who have undesirable views and opinions, which is something that, well, you say, oh, the U.S. government wouldn't do that. The U.S. government has done that periodically over the course of the last 200 years. We go through periods where we do that, and giving the government better tools to do that is frightening to me. So, and of course, to some extent, having that data in private hands means the government will probably get its hands on it, as it has done, not just through legal means by, you know, for example, subpoenaing companies with secret subpoenas that can only be defended in secret courts. And appealed to secret judges whose identities are often secret, but also through what I believe they refer to as extra legal means, but some of us might refer to as illegal, like hacking into companies. But when the government does it, apparently it's not illegal, it's just extra legal.
I'm laughing up here because we've got a guy who's going to talk about the government stuff, and he's up here taking notes while you're talking there, Daniel. I'm
Laughing a lot too.
And, you know, as much as I'd like to think that we have control over our privacy, I really don't think that any amount of obscurity that I try to put in front of that is going to guarantee my anonymity. I think that those two, you can't have those anymore. But, you know, to answer the question, what scares me is actually kind of two sides of the same coin. One is that we culturally will reject the practice of collecting and using data because there are just so many societal benefits of data use, among them being greater national private security, but also across healthcare, across education, across social services, and you know, just to say that, you know, the trade-off between our privacy and those things is too great would be, I think, a real shame. The other thing that scares me is that we are far faster innovators than we are legislators. And we really need to, you know, as a culture, very, you know, more quickly adjust to our ability to leverage technology. And I think that the public needs to be much more engaged with that process.
I'm told that we have to end just a little bit early to accommodate some other scheduling. So this is my warning to you folks. I just got a couple more questions, and we'll be asking for your questions from the audience. In talking about the individuals and lack of privacy, or it just flat out left us, should an individual be able to edit his or her information in databases? Should we have access to that so we can correct it?
Tell you, we're going to take it, whether it's given to us or not. You know, I was just reading, and yes, thanks for that wonderful intro there. I teed him up for that. I was just reading the Popular Science, my very favorite magazine, and one of their brilliant 10 for this year is a lady named Roxana. I cannot pronounce her last name. Look for her on page 58, Roxana Giambasu, maybe. And she is a student at the Columbia University, and her big passion is addressing things that really, really annoy her based on this article. And she's really taking it into her hands to develop solutions for the public to better track their own personal data across the cloud and across other applications, and be able to understand how it's being used, and also to be able to quickly to set self-destructs on certain types of data. So look into her, and I think that there's another few people I've been watching closely too who also have the same passion. And you know what? It's the same. It's really it's a value-based thing that's happening everywhere. It's happening in manufacturing. It's called the maker and controller consumer. You know, they're not passive anymore, and they're going to take things into their own hands.
We don't allow, you know, users to come in if we're putting up a database and change the truth or change that information. However, I think Wikipedia is, you know, an incredible experiment in people being able to tell the truth or tell the stories or change the story. And I think people have taken great care. We have some, you know, kind of self-policing that goes on our site as well. But I think it depends what type of database. That's a wide, you know, that question is really wide, because I think if we're offering a database that is factual and it's provided to us, no, people can't go in and change that type of information to change the truth or their history or their story. But I think it is interesting that people can, you know, take an active role in shaping who they really are, and based on truth.
I think ultimately, once you let your data out there, you're not going to be able to get it back. As a practical matter, the right to be forgotten is a big issue in Europe. But the truth is that Google, Yahoo, the NSA are all still collecting that data, and just because they're not surfacing it doesn't mean it's not there anymore. And I think. You know, regardless of what the law or morality ought to be on it, the fact of the matter is that that in the world of cheap digital storage, any data that is collected on you have to assume that it's out there forever and that it's out of your control.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that what you're seeing now is the reality of now. And I think that what we're seeing is a cultural movement toward control and transparency. So as much as we, you know, fear those big institutions, we do have some ability to regulate them and to protect ourselves in other ways beyond software. But certainly what we're seeing is people's recognition that this is an issue, and they're going to solve for it. You know, they're working to solve for it, and that's a cultural shift.
I think, though, what's interesting, and this is, you know, kind of an aside, but, you know, we get a lot of requests from people who don't like a past story we have done on them years ago. And it's, you know, maybe it could even be off of our site, but it still shows up in Google. Well, someone wants to kind of change their history and say, can you take that down because I had drug charges, you know, years ago. But, you know, people, potential employers are still finding that every time they search my name. You know, so we don't take down news stories. If it happened, it happened. But it is something that, people do want to change sometimes their story. So that's been a big debate for us, but we've just kind of said, all right, if we covered that as a truthful, factual story years ago, that's not going to be deleted just because someone requested it. But I know a lot of people who have, tried to go through Google and change things too, and they can't.
Okay, like I said, we're a little bit short on time, but we do have time for a few questions. Got one here, fell in the blue sweater. Is there a microphone in the house? Is there a microphone handler in the house? Here we go. Or why don't you just ask me and I'll, okay.
Is it on? Yeah. Hi, my name is Tibor. I'm part of the Serbian journalist group. First of all, I have to just say that for us, data mining, I mean, living in Eastern Europe with 60 years of communism, for us, data mining is just like the first stop towards Gulag. So we are terrified when we hear about stories like this. We're still recovering from the shock. I mean, the organization that used to data mine, sinister. Having said that, you know how like all the best things we have today basically came from the military or cereals, internet, TV, rubber, I mean, you name it. It first had the military use and then it sort of became civilian. Now, I just wonder if I can just shift the perspective. I mean, it all sounds really cool when you look at it from the US, but do you sometimes think that like all these data mining processes that you're developing can have a sinister use outside in a more sort of not democratic societies? Like all these algorithms, all these search ways to mine data, I mean, put in the wrong hands, they can actually bring a significant misery to people. Now, what I am interested in is, do you think it is that should be a concern of people who are developing it, or should we, at the other end, as a society, be the ones who should try to, or is it a collaborative effort, or?
It has to be, and believe me, the people that are developing it are grappling with this every day. As we get closer and closer to true artificial intelligence and the ability of machines to control themselves, yeah, we have big brains tackling those issues. IBM released a product into the market this week for small businesses to be able to access the Watson platform in business optimization, and it's real. It's not going to happen; it's happening now, and Watson can process data faster than any analyst can, and come up with conclusions that you can't explain. Only Watson knows. So there's they're building into those solutions the ability to explain reasoning and the ability to help a user backtrack the path that Watson got how he got there. So it's one of the things that they're really trying to do. But the problem is machines are really smart and people are really gullible, and we're really kind of, we don't know what we don't know, and so it's going to take a community of the consumer asking those questions and demanding, how are you protecting me from this, and being a voice in it. And it's going to have to be a regulated area of development that has some checks and balances along the way, that isn't just a genie that's let out of the bottle.
As Daniel said, though, it could be too late. It could already be out there, and how do you get that back? How do you get that information back? So it's concerning.
I think the answer is any tools that the people we think of as the good guys, which is obviously a relative term, depending on your worldview, have eventually the bad guys will have as well. Again, whoever you personally think the good guys and the bad guys are, or gals, so you know. Other than to be afraid, be very afraid, I don't know what the answer is.
That was fun. I had a question right here.
What is your employer doing for new job applicants? Is your employer asking new job applicants for their passwords for their social media sites so they can see what the applicant is doing?
No. We will look at, as we do with anyone, we will look at Facebook, Twitter, those types of things, but no, we would not ask for passwords.
In many cases, if they're not populating Facebook and LinkedIn enough, they're not invited to work for us.
Question right here from a fellow who's had his hand up for a long time here.
Hi, I'm Jacob Bick. I had a question specifically about dealing with data per capita. How can you account for, when dealing with data per capita, minority groups or smaller aspects of your data that might be suppressed when you're trying to gather it, so that you can tell a meaningful and truthful story without having to succumb to privacy?
I guess I'll take that one. Often it's a very, you have to try and look at it through many lenses. When we were looking at workplace fatalities, there is in fact data that gets suppressed because due to concerns that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has about personal privacy. For example, there are, if you're going to talk about the death of, osteopaths in Rhode Island, there aren't a lot of osteopaths in Rhode Island, and the data about that might be suppressed in their view to protect the privacy of the people who died. And whether or not I quite understand what their issue is with that, you end up having to look at the data at multiple levels so that you can find, okay, here's what's missing. And then how do I account for that? How do I make sure that my analysis is cognizant of that? And it's more than just telling your readers, oh, by the way, this might be bad because this is missing and that is missing. You need to do the best job you can to make the most accurate analysis you can, and to often fill in the gaps with other kinds of data that let you know how important what's missing is and how that would affect your conclusions.
I think when we started off talking about, even getting census data or getting report card data, there are very small variables that are left out. So that brings up a good point. You do have to report, and as we say, this is the information that we have. These are the things that you can expect to see here. This is what might be missing, but you do have to be as accurate as possible.
When often the marginalized or minority populations that we need to better understand, we need to come to them and create forums and opportunities for them to engage with us that we wouldn't necessarily need to do in other ways, but we need to adapt our approach very much to our audience and create the types of opportunities that they need to be heard.
We got time for one more question, and I believe it's going to come from you.
Yeah, just based on some of the discussion that I've heard kind of on this panel, and I'm approaching this from more of a strategic communication standpoint, but as far as the data mining goes, particularly for marketing and advertising firms that they're pulling from the social media and that sort of thing, a lot of the time they're just looking at sentiment, but beyond that, isn't it kind of our own responsibility to watch out for our own privacy? I mean, no one's forcing anyone to use these technologies.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because a lot of our exposure is because we want free stuff. Give us the free stuff. Give us the free fun stuff, So, and I was going to talk about this a little bit this afternoon, but it's a value exchange. You know, you can't have things for free in this. There isn't anything for free. Your perception that it should be for free is at fault. Businesses aren't built on free. So we need to help you better understand, you know, we need to be more transparent about how we're using data to drive our businesses. And you need to understand that this is a value exchange, and that everywhere you go on the internet, you're leaving basically fumes. Everything you touch is data. And so it's this exhaust of your trip through the ether space, and it's all being collected. And it's your ability to get that experience for free that's enabling that.
It's kind of what we were talking about with, you know, if you see something online that says fill this out and you'll get free Starbucks for a week, it's the same thing if you go into the mall and they say fill out this card and we'll put you in a drawing for winning this free car, you know, winning this car that's here. You know, they're not just doing it because they really want to be nice to you and hope that you win this SUV. I mean, they're doing it to collect data. So you have to know as a sophisticated person that what you're doing online is definitely leaving a trail. And yeah, you weigh that, but you do that kind of online and offline as well.
Dan?
Yeah, ditto.
Okay, on that we'll end. Thank you, panel. You've been very informing and engaging. Thank you, audience.
So it's time for lunch. I invite you all to go, if you're registered for the entire day, go outside, pick up a lunch, come right back as zippity quick as you can, because we have to really stay on time, and we have a lot to accomplish this afternoon. So quick, 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 go get a lunch.